goal of the National Space Society, and I'm paraphrasing our long-range vision, is to eventually settle space and to use the vast resources of space in terms of materials and energy to better and dramatically improve the lot of humanity. And this is important because resources on Earth, as everybody knows, are finite, and we're beginning to hit some of those limits, and particularly if you try to do things in a way that's environmentally benign. And that's becoming an increasing problem, which a lot of people are worried about. In fact, if you follow the literature about the future, there's a whole group of people that are sort of doom and gloom types that are saying things like, we need to reduce our standard of living in order to live within our means and consume very few non-renewable resources, and change our lifestyles dramatically in ways which amount to being a society at a much lower level standard of living. And even then, they'll say, okay, that'll get us maybe for another 1,000 years, but eventually that'll go away too. More extreme versions of that thought. There's actually a group called the Volunteer Human Extinction Society or something. And their idea is that humans are so evil because they consume all these resources and screw up the environment that we should, that what the right moral thing to do is to go extinct by having very few children and then lowering the population generation after generation until nobody's left. What we are doing with our arguments in an intellectual sense is saying, look, that's not true because you can smash all these limits to growth by taking into account the resources of the solar system, which are sun, for example, puts out 1 to 10 trillion times as much energy as the human race is currently utilizing. The materials in the asteroids alone can build space settlements, which are basically, in some loose sense, land area. Because a typical space settlement, O'Neill-type space settlement, would be a cylinder which is like 10 miles long and 2 or 3 miles wide. You spin it to give you artificial gravity inside, and you put dirt and stuff on the inside and create a very nice place to live. So you can have like trees and lakes and streams, and you bring in sunlight from the outside, and it looks like some of the best places on Earth. And you ask yourself, how much land area could you produce by building these settlements? And just from the material in the asteroids, which is roughly the right composition, that number comes out to about 3,000 times the land surface area of the Earth as it stands today, which is a huge number. I mean, when we went from the old world and we added the new world, that increased the land area that was available to the human race in some sense, or for civilization, by about 50%. And that had profound implications. Well, imagine what happens to a civilization that goes from X to 3,000X in terms of land area. And that's just the asteroids. Longer term, you could chew up the moons, the outer planets, and things like that. And you get up to numbers like 1 million, 10 million times land surface area of the Earth. So it's huge, okay? It is truly enormous. And through those means, you can smash all these limits, which for the most part take quite a while to actually get to before they get really serious. So you have some time to do this sort of thing.
So are those the goals then of the National Space Society, is to enable us as a species in order to go out and do this settlement? And how are we trying to do that today?
In the short run, what we do is we look at various space programs and other types of programs and find those which we think will advance us towards this goal the most, and then support those. And once you get through those, you can figure out the next steps, et cetera. It's fairly straightforward. Well, maybe not that straightforward, but reasonably straightforward as to what you should do now in order to get there. For example, we strongly support commercial space, because if you're going to have a space settlement, that means you have to have jobs in space, which means you have to have an economy in space. And the way to get a viable economy, as we found out on Earth, is not to have the government own everything. That's a disaster. But to have something like free enterprise to do stuff. And so we like commercial space for that reason, and also because it is very likely to lower things like launch costs. And of course, we're interested in the obvious places to have your first space settlement is either the Moon, Mars, the asteroids, or in some orbital type O'Neill-like settlement. And so, as a consequence, we are interested in exploring Mars, going back to the Moon, exploring Mars, and the asteroids in particular. And we're particularly interested in anything which uses resources on Mars and the Moon and asteroids rather than bringing everything from Earth, because you can't make it work economically unless you live off the land to a substantial extent. And we're also very interested in getting products in space, space economy, which then can be sold to Earth in order to make this all economically viable. Because to get where we want to go, you have to have a viable economy. And that leads us to things like support for space solar power. We're very excited about Planetary Resources, company that just was established a few months ago to mine the asteroids. And as Eric Anderson, one of the founders, said at this conference on last Friday, he got up there and literally said, our goals are exactly the same as those of the National Space Society. Well, when people like Larry Page, the CEO of Google, 15th richest person in the United States today, comes and says, we want to support your goals, and we think that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. So how can people become a member, and why should they join, and what can they do to help enable this and support in their own way?
The easiest thing to do to join is to Google National Space Society. That will take you to our website, and there's a very obvious button to push to join the organization. It's $20 a year for first-time members. If you join the organization, there's lots of things you can do to get involved. We lobby Congress. We have local chapters scattered around the world that you can get involved in. We have our annual conference, the ISD, the International Space Development Conference. And we're basically a grassroots organization, so as we've always been, we do have a paid staff, but probably the majority of our work, even at the national level, is done by volunteers. And we're always looking for new people to help out. So it's not, you just sort of raise your hand and say you want to help, and by one method or another, and a good chance you'll be recruited to do something. Let me say a little bit more about why doing what we're talking about is important. You look at the world today, people in the United States don't realize just how poor the average person in the world is as compared to the average in the United States. The average person in the world is about a factor of 7 below the standard of living as the average American. That means they're about a factor of 3 below the poverty level in the United States. And that's the average, which is sort of pushed up by the fact we have a few rich countries and a lot of really poor countries. Poor people are dramatically, by human standards, are at dramatically lower levels. There is, out of the 7 billion or so that we have today, 2 billion people that have no electric power, just to give you an example. Think about it, no electric power. One of the things that the human race clearly needs to do in the long run is to raise the standard of living of the average human, at least up to what we have in the United States today. And of course, in the meantime, we in advanced countries will increase our standard of living as well, because obviously we don't want to stop where we are now. And the world's population is also growing. So this means that the world's gross domestic product is going to be expanded by substantially more than a factor of 7, okay, just to accomplish what I mentioned. And where are you going to get the resources to do this? And to do it in an environmentally benign fashion. And if that's sort of your long-range goal, you really need to tap into the resources of space, because otherwise you just can't handle it, particularly if you put some environmental constraints on it. The other point I'd like to make, and related to that, and I'll make another point after that, related to that is that the American dream. Throughout the history of the United States, the average person has thought that their children will be better off than they are. Okay? However, a little bit before the current recession, polls indicated that for the first time in history, the average American thought that things were going to be worse off in the future. And the recession, of course, hasn't exactly increased people's optimism. The situation in Europe is a lot worse. They're much more pessimistic about the future than we are. Why is that? Because there's all these people running around talking about the doom and gloom of what's going to happen in the future and running out of resources and stuff. This is a way that we can restore the American dream, because we can come in and say, look, doom and gloom is not your future. Your future is one of prosperity, because the resources that can be obtained by this fashion vastly exceed the resources on the earth. It's basically unlimited for all practical purposes. And so you can go home and start thinking, you know, my children, my grandchildren are going to be a lot better off than I am. And that is profound, particularly to the American psychic. So I think for those reasons that what we're doing is really important. It's absolutely critical to the destiny of the human race.